So my name is Siddharth Saxena, and like you were just told, I'm an assistant professor at the National Law School of India University and an affiliated faculty with the Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer Chair for Public Law and Policy Choice at NLSIU. First of all, thank you so much for making it to this event, which is obviously a discussion of Louise Tillin's latest book, Making India Work, the Development of Welfare in a Multi-Level Democracy. Just to plug it again, the CUP stall set up outside is selling the book, so you can pick up your own copy after the session. A little bit about the V.R. Krishna Iyer Chair, which is sponsoring and co-organizing this event. So the V.R. Krishna Iyer Chair is a chair that was set up quite a while ago through a small donation by Justice V.R. Krishna Iyer, and looks at questions of public law and policy choice. So in many ways, this event is very much in line with the ambitions of the chair, given that Justice Krishna Iyer was deeply committed to and thoroughly contributed to socioeconomic rights as well as labor welfare, both on the Supreme Court bench as well as off it. Before I hand it over to Louise to begin her presentation, I'm going to just try and say a few words about the panelists. Hopefully I can add something about them that isn't already part of the program that I'm sure you would have read. So Louise Tillin is a professor of politics at the King's College London. Her work on Indian federalism and asymmetric federalism is what possibly most law students in the audience will be familiar with. However, she has been working on the politics of welfare for nearly as long. The two ideas obviously have a close relationship, as this book and her other work on the origins of centralized federalism in India show. As Louise notes in this book as well as elsewhere, the impetus for this book can be traced back not only to 2016, when she began collecting the archival material that it draws on, but in many ways further back to seeing the expansion of the social welfare provisioning work by the UPA government as a DPhil student studying state creation in India. Anindita Adhikari is an assistant professor at NLSIU and the vice chair of the BA program. She is working on a book project based on her PhD dissertation and fieldwork in Bihar, which looks at how bureaucratic accountability can be institutionalized in places with a long history of state failure, such as Bihar, through the interaction of the quotidian struggles of ordinary people against state power with embedding of civic norms. Rajendran Narayanan is an associate professor in the School of Arts and Sciences at Azim Premji University. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Rajendra and his report team and other members of his report team studied the performance of a scheme that I'm sure we'll discuss today, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, in 8 blocks in Bihar, Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Madhya Pradesh, to understand how it functioned to protect sort of the incomes of the rural poor. He is also the co-founder of LibTech, which brings together engineers, social workers, and social scientists who are committed to improving public delivery services. Arun Thiruvengadam, who is the moderator for today's session, is a professor at NLSIU and the faculty in charge of the V.R. Krishna Iyer Chair. He was also part of the founding faculty of the School of Policy and Governance at APU. There he taught a course on law and development in India, which he continues to teach a version of at NLS. The course was, amongst other things, motivated by a desire to broaden legal education beyond its almost insular focus on autonomous legal institutions. It sought to contextualize conversations about the role of law in economic development through an interdisciplinary study of law, society, and politics. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Louise.
Thank you very much, Siddharth, for that warm welcome. And thank you to the BIC and to NLSIU for organising and hosting tonight's event. It's a real privilege to be speaking here at the BIC a venue which I've heard so much about, and I'm very glad to be here. This is a book that I've been working on for the best part of the last decade, a book which I began to think about, as Siddharth says, while I was doing research in Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand for my then PhD about the creation of new states. And it was a period in which the rights-based era of social programming was in full swing in Delhi, and a period in which states like Chhattisgarh were fully embracing this a new form of welfare policy, especially rediscovering the public distribution system and the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, and really making them their own. This wasn't something I was working on for my PhD, but I was so struck by how important welfare provision was becoming in electoral politics that I have spent a lot of time since then following this story, both at the state level, but increasingly to thinking about the development of India as I don't use the word welfare state in the book, but certainly as a welfare regime. And as I wrote about the politics of welfare at the state level, it became strikingly clear to me that there was very little historical research which explained why the architecture of welfare in India has evolved in the way it has. An architecture which, as I will show you in this presentation, still remains very important today in ways that many people may not appreciate. Presenting this in Bangalore, in a state which has been probably the heaviest investor in the last couple of years in new forms of direct benefit transfer. I don't really need to say that welfare schemes are ubiquitous, but they are. They are central now to the way that all elections are contested, especially at the state level. And they are also ubiquitous because, and I think it is relatively uncontroversial to say this, they are an essential corrective to a model of economic growth in India that on its own has not been sufficient to generate sufficient secure employment for the majority of Indians or to tackle poverty and inequality. There is a lot of debate, and I'm sure we will enter into some of that debate in the question and answer about the implications of the centrality of the kinds of welfare schemes that have been in the ascendancy in the last decade for other forms of development expenditure. But there is no debate that they are incredibly important today. And the approach that India has taken to the design and rollout of welfare is also distinctive. India is the only place in the world that has invested so heavily, for instance, in employment generation programs in rural India, but also increasingly in urban India. It also stands out among other countries in the global south for having come to cash transfers, what in India are often called direct benefit transfers, DBTs, relatively late. So what I try to do in the book, and what I'll try to do today, is to take you through some of that story as to why India's welfare system has developed in the way that it has. Why has there been such neglect of the longer-term history of welfare policies in India? I suggest in the book that this is for a number of reasons. Partly, and perhaps most importantly, the decision of the architects of the Constitution to locate social and economic rights in the non-justiciable directive principles of state policy rather than in the fundamental rights, the justiciable part of the Constitution's preamble, has been interpreted as signalling a downgrading of the welfare project at a key juncture after independence. And that's something that Nidra Gopal Jayal notes in her wonderful book on citizenship in India. Added to that, I think there are two other reasons why this is a relatively neglected topic in scholarship on India's political economy. One is the kind of common sense that you can't build a welfare state until you've done economic development. And in fact, I quote Jawaharlal Nehru, in the first half of the book, almost explicitly saying this himself, that first you have to grow the size of the pie before you can start to redistribute it. And I think this common sense has prevailed. The other prevailing assumption in much of the scholarship on India's political economy is that clientelism and corruption, the discretionary disbursement of public resources, has so distorted public policy as to make it almost pointless to study the content of public policy. So clientelism has often loomed larger in what Kanchan Chandra notably described as India's patronage democracy than the content of the ideas that have informed the design of policies. And it's those ideas that I seek to recover. So the book seeks to provide a historical account of the foundational architecture of India's welfare regime. It looks at the content, and when I talk about the foundational architecture, I'm going back to the mid-20th century. The book starts in the late colonial period, but it's really at the juncture of, from the Second World War through to the period of independence, that I would describe the kind of foundational moments of the welfare regime that I describe. And I look at what is introduced, what is legislated on, and what isn't in this foundational moment, and how that shaped the development of welfare over the longer term. I focus particularly on employment and on social security policies, but there are also insights and implications for the way that education and health policy have also evolved over time. The book focuses on what I describe as three key periods when social provisioning has expanded. And this has taken place following the growth of different sectors of the economy, often in a way that is quite divorced from the growth of employment, and has driven countervailing pressures for new forms of social provisioning. So there are three key moments. The first, as I say, is in the late colonial period, and particularly in the period in the run-up to and after World War II, when we see a significant expansion of domestic industry, particularly of cotton textiles industry, but also other industries in the wartime economy, accompanied by rising industrial unrest, which creates the opening for social security for industrial workers, those whom today we understand as being located in the formal sector. The second period, in the 1960s, arises from the rise of agrarian capitalism, increased rural inequality following the Green Revolution, which leads to social security for agricultural labour. And the third period is that following liberalisation, when we see the growth of the capital and skill-intensive service sectors of the economy, which led to or opened the window for the introduction of social policy for informal sector workers. What I show is that at each of these junctures, political and economic actors within India's multi-level institutions, Siddharth mentioned my abiding interest in federalism, and I'm afraid I haven't left it behind with this book, the dynamics of politics across levels of government create different forms of social policy innovation. And that this kind of multi-level electoral competition has been, in many ways, more important than ideological or party-based competition. At each stage, as I try to show, it's not only the interests of labour that have been important in shaping social policy, the interests of capital have also been central to the kinds of policies that have been introduced and the kinds of policies that haven't been introduced. So it's certainly not as straightforward as thinking that politics has worked to intervene against markets. This is a multi-class story. The title, Making India Work, has two meanings. The first focuses on work, suggesting that social policy has in many ways centrally been shaped by the conundrum of how to put Indians to work, especially in a context in which those growth sectors of the economy have not been employment intensive or heavily generating of large-scale employment. The second meaning of the title points to the significance of welfare in making India work. So the emphasis there is more on India working rather than Indians working. And I suggest that the way that welfare policies have been designed have been significant both for how India had the phase of nation building, both on the economic front and on the political front. This territorial dimension is important. On the economic side, welfare, in terms of building a national economy, welfare has been important for the ways in which it has involved the regulation of interregional, interstate economic competition, and efforts to avoid a so-called race to the bottom in conditions for workers across the country. And this is part of the reason why India has ended up with a set of labour laws and labour regulation that it has. The second meaning is more political, and that is to say that policy innovation has been spurred by the intensification of multi-level electoral competition, and that this is part of the story of democratic consolidation. So both on the economic side and on the political side, welfare has been a more central part of the project of nation building than I think has hitherto been sufficiently recognised. I'll now just talk briefly through the three parts of the book before we open up for discussion. So the first part of the book is entitled Building a National Economy, Regulating Internal Competition. And this first part begins in late colonial Bombay, just after the First World War, just as the influenza epidemic has arrived in Bombay. This is a moment when there is increasing unrest arising in Bombay, partly as a result of the changing economic geography of the cotton textiles industry in the early 20th century. And I'll just go to the next slide to show you what I mean here. Those of you with really good eyesight may be able to determine the triangles and diamonds on this map, but let me help you if your eyesight is, if you struggle with eyesight like I do. So, if you can see, if I can point this, here's Bombay, and there's a large triangle here. And here's Calcutta, the other leading centre of industrialisation in the colonial period, the centre of the jute industry. Bombay, of course, the heartland of cotton textiles industry. Dotted over the rest of the map, which you probably won't be able to see, are much smaller triangles. I'm just showing you where they all are. These are all much smaller centres, newer centres of cotton textiles. The diamonds, however, are all centred in and around Calcutta. So the jute industry is very territorially concentrated. Cotton textiles industry is spread out increasingly over much of India. And these so-called up-country mills, as they were known at the time, were engaged in fierce competition with Bombay, undercutting Bombay in terms, especially in terms of wages, the cost of labour. This in turn put incredible pressure on mill owners in Bombay, who responded by cycles of rationalisation, laying off workers, seeking to reduce wages, which prompted greater industrial unrest in Bombay. And it was in this context, also at a moment when India had just joined the International Labour Organization in 1919, and new forms of social insurance were being debated in the ILO, that a policy debate began to be incubated in Bombay about the desirability of some form of social insurance to stabilise industrial relations, labour relations in Bombay. This was by no means a consensual process, and it is a great stretch to say this is something that industrialists were very enthusiastic about. But policymakers, labour officials in Bombay were enthusiastic, as were some of the moderate labour leaders who came to speak for India also in the ILO, particularly N.M. Joshi. who was a kind of key figure in these debates. And it was here then that the idea of sickness insurance, contributory sickness insurance for industrial workers, which would involve both workers and employers paying a certain proportion of salary depending on the wages into an insurance fund to provide workers with medical leave if they were ill, or an access to healthcare in periods of sickness, was incubated. However, both employers and policymakers in Bombay were absolutely convinced that this could only happen in Bombay if such policies were introduced on a national level, because otherwise employers in Bombay would face even higher labour costs and would lose out even more significantly in the competition with these other upcountry mills. So this is the beginning of the impetus for social security for what is now understood as India's formal sector for industrial workers. Interestingly, today, we still calculate the size of the formal sector by virtue of how many people are insured by the Employees State Insurance Act, the sickness insurance legislation that came out of this period of policy development. So, as I suggest in the book, the evolution of social security is also a story of the evolution of the formal sector, and by virtue of that, the informal sector of the economy too. But it took some further developments for the idea of sickness insurance and social security for industrial workers to gain traction at the national level, which of course was essential for it to actually be introduced in a place like Bombay. And there is a kind of interesting detour in the book through what was, for me, one of the most fascinating finds, which was the role of Ambedkar in all of this. Ambedkar, of course, well known for his standing as a leader of Labour, less well known for the role that he played during the war following the Quit India movement, when he became member for Labour on the Viceroy's Executive Council in 1942, literally as the Quit India movement took shape. And it was in this position on the Viceroy's Executive Council that Ambedkar was able to push ahead with a programme for social security at the national level for industrial workers. He was so invested in this idea that he went as far as to persuade the Viceroy to extend an invitation to Sir William Beveridge to come to India. Those of you who know something about the history of welfare states internationally may be familiar with William Beveridge, who had published the Beveridge Report in Britain during the war in 1942, who is considered really to be the father of Britain's welfare state. And Ambedkar was so taken with what Beveridge had done in that report that he sought to invite him to India and write a Beveridge Report for India. And Beveridge was hugely excited about this idea. Beveridge's parents had worked in India. Beveridge himself had been born in India. And he was really keen for this to be his next project after the Beveridge Report in Britain. However, the whole thing fell apart because Beveridge wanted a completely wide canvas. He said, if I were to think about the problem of welfare in India, the problem of social security in India, I would not start with social security for industrial workers. I would want a completely blank canvas to also look at questions of agricultural productivity and other questions of development. And Ambedkar refused. He said, no, I only want you to look at social security for industrial workers. And Beveridge said, well, if that's the offer, then I withdraw. I mention this because it is at a crucial founding moment, the key insight into why India still today has a very developed architecture of social security for the formal sector, but a less well-developed architecture for other sectors of the economy. And I think this is kind of an insight from a pivotal moment. And Ambedkar's role in it as well is fascinating to me, and I think has hitherto not been well explored. So what you end up with is this, the Employees State Insurance Act, which was passed by the Constituent Assembly of India, sitting as the Legislative Assembly in 1948, before the promulgation of the Constitution, and before even social and economic rights had been relegated, if you like, to the directive principles of the Constitution. And the proponents of this act in the Constituent Assembly saw it as hugely important that this was to be the nucleus of a future Indian welfare state, that it could be indefinitely extended to other categories of workers when at such time as this was financially feasible. So that's the story in the first part of the book, a first envisioning of what an Indian welfare state might look like and the kind of policies that it might build from. However, things changed quite quickly after independence, and that's the story that I tell in the second part of the book, which is entitled Putting India to Work. Here I look at the significance of especially the second five-year plan and the decisions made by Jawaharlal Nehru and PC Mahalanobis as the architects of that second five-year plan to focus on capital-intensive industrialisation rather than labour-intensive industrialisation, and the effects of this for the ongoing development of the welfare state. What this meant, and this was a quite conscious decision, there's lots of writing from Mahalanobis at the time where he explicitly acknowledges that this will be the effect, so as to create a high efficiency, low employing, small organised sector of the economy that would be subject to forms of social security, and that the mass-based employment of Indians would have to take place outside of that highly efficient organised sector and in conditions of low productivity and without any apparatus of social security. The assumption being that people would continue to rely on informal forms of social security, namely family and village networks, kinship networks, in periods in which they fell on hard time. So you have the rather artificial curtailing of a process of rolling out social insurance, so artificial that not only does it mean that social insurance was confined to the formal sector, but that the agenda of developing social insurance, even for the formal sector, was cut off. Crucially, this meant that unemployment insurance was never agreed to, even though at the time of agreeing to sickness insurance, this was seen as a necessary adjunct. What you end up with instead are restrictions on retrenchment of workers rather than a form of insurance that might support workers when they're laid off by firms. And this has been very significant still today when we think about the debates over labour law reforms. Beyond that small formal sector, the focus for most Indians and the discourse of a Nehruvian welfare state was instead on activating a duty to work. This was a duty that involved Indians girding their loins. This is to use language from a pamphlet called The Road to the Welfare State, published by the Ministry of Community Development in the 1950s, that Indians needed to gird their loins and get down to hard work in order to pull themselves up. But the idea here being that work was part of a process of self-realisation that would contribute to nation building. And I think that language of a duty to work we see returning today as well in contemporary debates about welfare. In the latter part of the second part of the book, I then show what happens in the absence of a model of labour-intensive industrialisation, given the failure of a Nehruvian programme of agrarian development to take off in the way that he had envisaged. So without labour-intensive industrialisation that could pull workers at scale out of low productivity, rural agricultural employment, and in the wake of the Green Revolution, which led to the breakdown, erosion of earlier patron-client relations in the countryside, we start to see policy attention turning to the need for forms of social security for the rural poor. This is also a period in which poverty and unemployment starts to be enumerated in much finer detail, and much more attention is being driven to how severe the problem of unemployment and underemployment was, both in rural areas and in urban areas. And the outcome of this phase of policy development was the return, if you like, because these rural employment programs actually date back to the Famine Commission periods of the late 19th century, but the re-embrace of public works programs, rural employment programs, initially at the state level, especially in Maharashtra with the Employment Guarantee Scheme, but also then at the national level with various iterations of food for work programs and rural employment programs that grow over the course of the late 1970s into the 1980s. And these are the kind of precursors of what today we know as Narega, spurred on by increasingly intense electoral competition between parties at the national level and the state level. There's a period, obviously, of running into and after the emergency, with new opposition parties emerging in contestation with the Congress Party and driving some of this policy development. And most of the focus in this period then on employment generation. But I show that just on the eve of liberalisation, we were also starting to see the emergence of a different kind of policy approach to welfare, focused more on the protective dimensions of social policy rather than on promoting work, getting people into work, focusing on providing for people who were unable to work, either through disability or through life cycle contingencies that meant that they can't, sell their labour in the labour market. So that's maternity, sickness, old age. New policies that are beginning to be developed, especially in Tamil Nadu. So there is, I think, if the first part of the book is implicitly talking, and actually I explicitly use these terms in the book, is describing a Maharashtra model of social security, we start to see by the late 1980s the significance of an emergent Tamil Nadu model, which then later on is scaled up at the national level. So finally, to talk about the third part of the book, which picks up the story of liberalisation and its implications for social policy. Firstly, I show why the absence of an unemployment insurance policy became so significant, came back to bite policymakers 40 years after it was first discussed in the planning era. And this is because there was no policy to provide protection to workers who were being laid off by sick firms after the reforms of 1991. And one of the first things that the Narasimha Rao government was trying to do was to introduce, with the support of the World Bank and other donors, an exit policy to enable the exit of labour from sick industries. And that exit policy became a focal point for opposition to the reforms from the left. And the government was quite quickly forced to quietly withdraw its efforts to create an exit policy. And instead, it rather deftly renegotiated the loan that it had agreed with the World Bank to support its exit policy, renegotiated that in order to protect its existing social safety net. So no exit policy, no reform to the Industrial Disputes Act, Chapter 5B, which prevents firms with over 100 workers from retrenching them without a government approval. None of that, but the redirection of World Bank loan to supporting especially the employment programs, which I've just described as having taken shape in the 1980s, and the public distribution system. So this means that, at least in the early aftermath of liberalisation, although there was a slight dip in social expenditure, there was no major discontinuity in policy design. When we start to see that discontinuity emerge is from the mid-1990s onwards. And this, again, is an electoral story. The drivers of policy change in the most immediate sense come out of the changing nature of electoral competition in what was very evidently by this stage a post-Congress polity in which regional challengers to the Congress party were introducing new forms of what some Congress politicians at the time described as direct benefits. This is the first time I found the reference to the direct benefits term, which is obviously so prevalent today. In states like Andhra Pradesh, in Karnataka, in Tamil Nadu especially, And the Congress Party leadership themselves, as Congress started to lose state election after state election, came under pressure from their own politicians to do more to expand direct benefits to workers, labour market outsiders, if you like, in the informal sector. So this is the point at which we see the introduction of the National Social Assistance Programme, which is scaled up and in fact is designed by the Tamil Nadu architect of Tamil Nadu's social policies, scaled up at the national level. So a really significant moment in terms of the reorientation of a welfare regime towards workers outside of the formal sector. And then in the final chapter of the book, I look at what I describe as the two competing visions, which have each vied for ascendancy from the late 1990s onwards. One of these being a pro-market, an approach to welfare which has been enabled by liberalisation, in particular the liberalisation of insurance markets, which have opened up new ways of thinking about how to insure people against different life cycle contingencies. So, of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with Ayushman Bharat and different forms of health insurance. These become possible from the late 1990s as a result of the insurance market liberalisation. And the other very important approach, of course, is the advent of the rights-based approach, which is particularly associated with the coming to power of the UPA government, Congress-led UPA government from 2004 onwards. And I suggest that neither of these visions have achieved hegemony in this period, but both have shaped, if you like, the debate about the role for the state in regulating the economy in the interests of society. So to conclude, I hope I've convinced you that India's welfare regime deserves to be better understood, and that in order to understand it, we need to understand its history. I suggest that while clientelism and limited resources have per force constrained the development of welfare, that today's policies are the product of long-run debates about how to design an Indian welfare state. Welfare regime development has been integral to the project of nation building, and it has also been shaped by multi-class interests in very important ways. I'd like to conclude by bringing us right up to the present to say that I think the current discourse around welfare policies as freebies is far too reductive of a much more complicated story. Welfare has been central to the way in which market competition has been regulated and in which democracy has functioned in a labour-abundant economy. Welfare has been essential and will continue to be essential to making India work. We need to understand welfare and work in tandem, and we need to understand that the development of a welfare state in India is deeply intertwined with what I would suggest is the stilted nature of India's structural transformation of the economy. And there I will conclude.
Thanks, Louise. I think you managed to pack quite a lot in a very short presentation. Similar to the book, I was just thinking the book itself is about 210 pages, but as we've just heard, it covers from 1919 right up to the present, and through the episodes that Louise focuses on, I think she makes us think about welfare, but also a lot more. That was my quick impression. As you can tell, Siddharth read out our backgrounds, and this is truly a interdisciplinary book which engages with multiple fields of knowledge. As I was listening to Louise, I was thinking of her earlier work, and I think Siddharth and Louise referred to it, but I'll just say a little bit about that because it'll help, I think, foreground the discussion that we're having. So Louise's first book that I read, I think this is your third sole authored book. The 2013 book is called Remapping India, New Indian States and Their Political Origins. And what Louise does really is look at the formation of Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand and Uttarakhand, and explain to us how their formation in 2000 was a very important moment in the history of India. For those who study federalism, this was a real departure from the earlier trends in federalism. Since 1956, states were reorganized on a linguistic basis, and this marked a departure. So it's, again, a wonderful book which explores it through multiple lenses. Later, a few years later, Louise wrote Oxford India's short introduction to Indian federalism, where again she's looked at the questions of federalism. And when I read this book, my quick thought was this is almost a distillation of all your earlier work. And in a way, this is a book also about, as Louise explained, welfare policy at the broader national level. And I think what's really new in this book is a very careful exploration of the Employee State Insurance Act of 1948, which is a pre-constitutional legislation, but as she explained, really helps us understand what the framers, and Renuka Rai, K. Santanam, who were quoted, were really in the Constituent Assembly drafting the Constitution of India. And I think Louise makes very important arguments from history, legal history, and then combines a multiple range of methods to explore this vast area. In the introduction, Louise mentioned, and I think that may have been a provocation for the book, that there's something called the Oxford Handbook of the Welfare State. This is published in 2010, and it refers largely to the usual suspects, the Scandinavian countries, North America, Europe. There's a little bit of Asia, but that's East Asia. And I think Louise mentions that there's no South Asia. India is not mentioned. And all I will say is that after this, I don't know if there's going to be a new edition of the Oxford Handbook, but Louise's book will be mandatory reading for anyone interested, not just in the Indian welfare state or regime, as she prefers to call it, for good reasons. But it's also, and I mentioned that to say, this is also a very globally oriented book. So it gives us a lot to understand welfare and welfare politics in India. But what I was very struck by is that from the framing chapter till the end, there's always a reference to what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think that's very hard to pull off. I'll stop, but just to give you a sense of the book as a whole. Siddharth has already introduced Anindita and Rajendran. The way we thought we'd structure it, because Louise has been so punctual, we will, each of the two panelists will speak for about 10 minutes. Then we will have a brief discussion. Louise will respond to their comments. Maybe we'll have a quick discussion and then throw it open to the audience, because we have a house full today, and I see there's a range of people here. There are law students, academics from various disciplines, and I'm sure we'll have a very interesting and fruitful conversation. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Anindita for her remarks first.
Okay, hi everyone, and thanks Louise for giving us a quick read of what is already quite a breezy 211 pages of what I think is an extremely ambitious story of history of the Indian welfare state. So firstly, huge congratulations on what I think is a fantastic new book. And thanks Arun and you, Louise, for inviting me to discuss this book. It's really heartening to see a room full of people for a discussion on the welfare state and welfare regimes. So I loved the book. I also loved how immensely teachable it is. And I think some of us have been talking about, we already assign your work in our classes. But the book really is packed with extremely lively accounts and of how unlikely protagonists, so, like in the industrialists, the mill owners, and unlikely opponents, which, as you pointed out in this case, is Ambedkar, and why Ambedkar opposed the beverage report, potential beverage report in India, is something that we would like to unpack, and many surprising dynamics to explain policy choices that were made at various junctures in India's very long history of welfare. So what I particularly liked was that each part, and I encourage you all to read it, because each part of the book begins with a very provocative puzzle, which is then very meticulously examined and unpacked through a really impressive range of sources, from archival material to interviews to, of course, your own long-standing work on subnational welfare politics and work on the post-2000s politics of welfare, particularly under the UPA regime. So I do want to briefly just comment on the significance of the book, as Arun has, because while the scholarship on Indian welfare has really been quite vast and quite varied across disciplines, so economics, sociology, political science, there really hasn't been an authoritative attempt at mapping its political origins and evolution from the colonial to the post-colonial present. So there are rich historical narratives of India's political economy, think Atul Kohli, Pranab Bardhan, the Indian state, Sudipto Kaviraj, and the changing nature of Indian democracy, but nothing that provides an account of the configuration of the conditions and critical junctures over multiple political and economic phases of transformation, which explain why we have the social policy mix that we did in a particular period, why it endures, what was the residue of one period and how did that stickiness carry forward to the following period, and why the unevenness in social policy adoption and implementation across regions endures. So, of course, with Louise's work on subnational welfare regimes, you would really move the scholarship on social policy in India beyond single cases towards a comparative perspective, which engages really seriously with variation in policy adoption and implementation across states. And it really gave us a framework within which we can situate different states in India. So, to go back to your previous work on, you'd call Andhra and Tamil Nadu competitive populist states where political parties introduce welfare policies with a broad-based appeal, or incorporationist states like Odisha and Chhattisgarh where politics is still dominated by a pretty narrow socioeconomic elite, but social assistance is still prioritized, and so on. But this work really left us with the question of what does this amount to in the aggregate? What does this tell us about the case of India? So this book really brings together several threads of, Louise, your long-standing work on social policy at both the national and subnational level, and fills this much-needed gap in mapping the history of welfare really in the world's largest democracy. So it's really a pity that we don't have more, but this is going to be hopefully the start of much, much more historical work on the Indian welfare state. Welfare regime. So the sheer scope and sweep of the book, which pulls together state and society dynamics over little more than a century to explain how the world's largest democracy has what is quite disappointingly still a hyper-truncated welfare regime with one of the lowest levels of spending amongst its peers, but is also a precocious and what John Harris calls an audacious welfare regime, which really punches above its weight, is in itself quite field-defining. So the book takes on this difficult task of telling a story both in the aggregate while remaining really attentive to state-level dynamics. So as I said, all this in a very quick 211 pages. So now a few thoughts on the arguments presented in each book and some questions to extend their implications. So first, the book defines the welfare regime in terms of social policy choices and types, or a mix of policies. But if welfare regimes, as you say, are about the content of India's policy mix, it is also then about institutional choices and how welfare will be delivered and not just what. So if we are to map the same phases in the book to what kinds of institutional choices were made, we could also identify distinct patterns. And I'd love to hear you say more about what you think about what some of these patterns are. So for instance, we see in the pre-independence period or in the Nehruvian years, the emphasis was on scientific knowledge, rational organization, and technical expertise. So here I'm thinking about early public health campaigns, such as eradicating malaria through DDT spraying, or controlling TB through BCG vaccinations, or eradicating smallpox through the spread of the cowpox vaccine. All vertical, top-down campaigns that targeted very specific diseases and favor technical fixes instead of building an infrastructure of public health more broadly in the country. So here we see that state legitimation was the objective, not democratization of development planning. And then we see, of course, in the 1990s came the radical scheme for democratizing governance, the planning and monitoring and implementation of welfare, the Panchayati Raj system. So this was followed again by further elaborate structures for citizen participation, oversight, and implementation through NREGA, NREG as we know it, but several other rights-based welfare legislations that you discuss. So really the first question is, how would you explain and trace the choice of institutional design that accompanied the choice of the social policy mix? The second the second prominent theme, which features quite squarely in the second part of the book, focuses on the making of the welfare citizen or the recipient of welfare. And you touched upon this in your presentation. So we see that the state's vision of the welfare recipient has been one, in the early years, of course, has been one that is duty-bound to the nation, highlighting the virtue of contributing voluntary, collective action for the greater good of the country, and so on. Their work was seen as a duty of citizenship. And we know this even with the work of Nikhil Menon, that planned consciousness of the early post-independence period also sought to pursue the task of state building by cultivating the spirit of self-sufficiency, which of course has resurfaced today in the form of all this messaging around Atmanirbharta and so on, right? So, so now it might seem like I'm countering what I just said, but the book does provide a somewhat statist and institutionalist account of welfare, where there is an acknowledgement of policy feedback effects. But this is largely in terms of how parties and political leadership in states adopted or led different trajectories of welfare reform. But how did the nature of public commitment change? How did levels of responsiveness in the citizenry change, or those who are the recipients of welfare themselves? How did it change the way ordinary people and welfare recipients engage with the state and politics? What kinds of local constituencies were created which fought for the maintenance of welfare over time and fought against retrenchment? And again, I use the term, I use a term called user publics, which I use in a paper with Patrick Heller about the cultivation of new forms of participation associated with the post-2000 welfare reforms. And I'm curious to know to hear what you think about what these user publics might have looked like over the periods of time that your book addresses. So again, using the term protective welfare for rights-based legislation does perhaps flatten to a little extent the scale, reach, and really the distinctiveness of particularly the post-2000s era of welfare expansion, which was more than just instituting social and economic rights. It was also about instituting civic and political rights, or what Jenkins and Manor call governance rights, which is slightly more technical. I would prefer political and civil rights. So I guess the question here is, how did the choice and type of welfare shape citizenship and spur or contain civic action in different phases that the book covers? And my third and final comment is on how ideas of welfare percolated or went back and forth between the rural and the urban. So how has the rural-driven welfare ideas and the urban? So the book treats these two as slightly distinct spheres. So the first part of the book traces the evolution of social policy, social insurance and how it evolved in cities for urban industrial workers, as you pointed out. And the second part of the book takes the Green Revolution as the turning point and discusses the expansion of the rural policy agenda. But we see that the biggest expansion in welfare post the Green Revolution, and even more so in the post-liberalization period, has been in rural India. So whether it's the community development program, in fact, late 1950s, all the way up to the right to food or the right to work acts of the early 2000s have been about extending social security to informal workers in the rural, in the countryside. So the terrain of welfare policy in rural India, and we could argue, has far outpaced urban India, right? So in your research, did you find any evidence or, any glimpses or glimmers of how lessons from the rural, whether it was in terms of how work was defined or how workers were defined, or more recently, the ideas of mean-tested social assistance may have traveled or have also been rejected in the urban welfare policy debate. And a more recent example to think through this with, and Rajendran will say more perhaps, is the urban employment guarantee, which is under consideration in some states. And maybe that's a starting point to be able to think about how the rural may actually provide more light and a more expansive imagination of what welfare looks like for urban India. So I'll stop there and I look forward to your comments.
Thanks, Soni. Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Arun and NLS, for giving the opportunity to be part of this panel. First is many, many congratulations. I think it's an extraordinary work of scholarship. I very strongly recommend all of you here to get a copy and read the book. I've learned extensively by reading this book. So I'll start from the perspective of being a practitioner and an observer of many rights-based legislation today. So the way I read the book is to see, okay, we have a sense of where we are today, and the book traces a part of the journey, a trajectory of how we got where we are today. Now, I'll try to draw, the way I read the book is again trying to draw parallels between the different time periods that you talk about, the different, the pre-war period, subsequently the Green Revolution period, and then the post-liberalization period. The three parts, how they talk to us today. What are the parallels that we can draw today? So that's the vantage point I come from. And one of the first things that struck me when reading the book is that it's a story about the development of welfare, all right. But at the same time, it's also a story about the permanence and the persistence of capital in the country. And welfare, I think you give the example of Esping Anderson in the book, and around that area where you talk about the idea of a welfare state or a welfare regime is something where the standard of living of individuals are maintained despite whatever the market forces are. So I think that in a way sets the tone for the book as well, saying that, okay, we have to agree that capitalism is going to exist. We have to agree that whatever kind of welfare we envision, it's going to be a scaffolding for capital to survive. So is that a conscious choice? That's something, or can we think of welfare regimes outside the bounds of capital also? And how will it look? That's something I do not know. And maybe you can reflect. Obviously, the Ambedkar's response to Beveridge report, clearly, I mean, that's something that from the first part of the book that really screamed at you loudly, that here was a person, 1943, just a day after Quit India movement started. Ambedkar is a member of Labour in the Viceroy's Executive Council, and he has a clean kind of canvas to say what kind of welfare regime we can get into, and invites Beveridge here, but then for whatever reason chooses to focus on the tiny minuscule industrial working class as opposed to the entire working class. And I think Beveridge had this very nice formulation where he said cradle to grave social policy. But here we are focusing on only one aspect, that too only in the employment aspect. So what could have been, what are your speculations on that? Are there fiscal considerations because India didn't have the kind of money to go for the entire canvas? Were there fiscal limitations which prevented going from an insurance to an assurance model of health? And that continues, that persists even today, that we still rely on insurance and not assurance for health. Not just for the industrial workers, but for everyone. So what are your speculations around that? That's one thing that I think I'd be very curious to, I think everyone here would be curious to know that. So that's one question I have from that time period that you discuss in your book. The other question, okay, I have two questions from that time period. The other question is health and labor. Both of them are part of the concurrent list of the Constitution of India. Now, is this happenstance, or were these kind of decisions that were made during the 1940s and even before 1919, from the time ILO was formed, or the Royal Commission of Labour in India, leading up to the Constituent Assembly, and the fact that only the industrial working class was chosen as the class for which social insurance would be provided in the context of employment? So there is an interplay between labor and health that's happening there, and we find that to be in the concurrent list of the Constitution. So how is there something that's flowing from there here, or that's one question? Now, again, my favorite part of the book was, of course, this earlier part gives you a lot of excellent kind of scholarship and research, which I was not aware of. But then the most interesting read for me was the Nehru Mahalanobis period, all the way up to Green Revolution and subsequent, till we reach, I mean, the entire book is great, but that was my favorite part, I would say. So again, the sense of duty, right? So in Nehru's time, Mahalanobis time, we we listen, there is a bifurcation of the choice of welfare that's happening there. The industrial working class is capital intensive, they are getting some kind of social protection, but the entire large swath of rural working class, the concept of duty, that you have a duty to work, you have a duty of kind of self-reliance in making consumer goods and cottage industries flourish in your area. So the word duty, and obviously we see a lot of resonance with that duty today. But what is interesting to me is the meaning and the interpretation of the word duty back in the day was towards fulfilling a kind of citizenship. But the nature of citizenship and the way duty is used today is slightly different. And what I mean by that is, for example, there is demonetization, there's national lockdown, and people have said that it's your duty to obey. So is it a kind of discipline and punish kind of approach of duty that we see today vis-a-vis then? And what does it mean for citizenship in this differing definitions of duty? So I'm curious to know what you think of that. Then the Green Revolution period, I think that's a phenomenal, because there's a lot of new things that I learned from there. And it was illuminating to see how subsequent to Green Revolution, when Maharashtra came up with this employment guarantee scheme to allay some of there was excess production that was happening through Green Revolution. And many landed gentry were actually in favor of an employment guarantee scheme, which was very counterintuitive when I first read it, but then upon reflection, it made sense that they wanted an employment guarantee scheme, not because of any empathy for the working class, not because of any constitutional sense of equality, but it came from a point that, okay, I want labor in my monsoon agricultural harvest time. So if there is an employment guarantee scheme, this rural workforce is not going to migrate, but stay back. So that I can have, I mean, if I'm landed gentry, that would be the kind of people I would want to retain. So that I found very fascinating, which is very distinct from what we see the farmer-worker relations in India today. And then one of the things that stood out for me, which perhaps it's an intentional choice, you do talk about the rise of regional parties around this time, and a lot of them were farmer-based parties, especially in the North India. You see, they have now a seat in the parliament, which is very new. We didn't see, because it was largely a Congress-driven landed gentry that was in the parliament. But now in this part of post-Green Revolution, we also see a lot of farmer groups that get into the parliament. But for some reason, caste is not explicitly discussed as part of this caste-based assertion. Is that an intentional choice? What was the thought behind not including that is something that I wanted to understand. Then, of course, the framework of promotional and protective, I found that to be a very useful typology for many of us who work actively on welfare. And as Oni also said, that protectionist or protective, can appear to be a little limiting. So the reason I bring that up is because if you think that we need to come up with a rubric to think about welfare policies, and you in your presentation, you said at the end, the concept of freebies and welfare should be differentiated. So keeping that in mind, if we think of rights-based legislations like NREGA or NFSA, and you think of them as promotional and protective as two ends of the spectrum, and suppose we need to create a rubric to evaluate policies, and by evaluate, I don't mean randomized control trial kind of evaluation, but for us to think about whether it's a freebie, whether it's a dole, or whether it's a right or an entitlement. So how can we creatively use this framework of promotional and protective in understanding that? Because in your book, you say EGS was a promotional idea, which probably it was, but Narega has a very different meaning, because it's a rights-based, it's an activation of citizenship, and that was the thought behind it. So how do we understand, if we have to create a rubric, how would it look like? And I think you do, because the reason, again, this goes back to the question of the distinction between welfare and populism also. And Srini is going to be a discussant with you in Chennai, I suppose. He recently wrote very nicely where he talks about the twin models in Tamil Nadu itself. And he talks about, he says in his article that it's assertive populism and paternalistic populism in the context of Tamil Nadu. But I was a little uncomfortable with the usage of the word populism there. Because again, the question is, what is welfare? What is populism? Is there an easy way to distinguish and demarcate those things? And then finally, I come to the last period, which is the post-1991 period that you talk about, which I found very interesting and counterintuitive to finally see the beverage version play out post-1991, when for the first time we are seeing a holistic approach to welfare, to social security, especially I think Guhan's remarkable papers that God knows how you unearthed them, but it's clearly, they're a rich minefield, because that really gives us a sense of how protective, meaning protective social security in the sense of old age, maternity would probably fall in protective, yeah. So pensions especially. So all those kinds of the way to think about the architecture of social security, which was very counterintuitive to me, that 1991 is a watershed period when liberalization has happened, markets are opening, and now the informal sector is getting even more informalized, if it's possible, because there's more precarity and so on that's happening. Now, in this scenario, did the lawmakers see that this was going to create a kind of crisis, high levels of regional imbalance? And this is something that you allude to in your book on federalism as well, that there was lots of regional imbalance, whether it's Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh versus the richer southern states. And hence, they foresaw the need for protective social security to be put in place. Or was it just something, a patchwork, more of a, okay, I need to do something that's emerging? So that, and one of the things, again, going back to an overarching theme from the 50s to 70s, is this area of, I think Ani very importantly talked about institutional settings. And I think one important institution over there which does not get adequate mention is the judiciary. Because this was, between the 50s and 70s, was this period of parliament and judiciary, parliament and the judiciary being at loggerheads with each other almost, with many landmark judgments that happened around this time. And it was fundamentally a conflict between directive principles of state policy, which embody the socioeconomic rights, versus the fundamental rights. So that kind of conflict, and the whole conflict emerged because of a process of nationalization. There was nationalization of banks, abolition of privy purses, land reforms, all those kinds of nationalizing idea has now morphed into a nationalism idea. So this transition from nationalization to nationalism, this transition, the same word, duty, being used again, the idea of welfare and freebie, I think there is a kind of duality that's playing out. And I want to understand, you talked about the downgrading of citizenship because socioeconomic rights were part of the directive principles. But I think through the rights-based legislation, we have an upgrading of citizenship as well. But despite that upgrading of citizenship, we are seeing a scenario where labor is getting increasingly atomized. We see ability to form federations and bargaining power going down. So what does it mean for citizenship? And I think Ani and I were discussing earlier about the emerging economies, like gig economy. This is going to further splinter the workforce, the informal sector. So how do we think of citizenship around this time? And one last thing is that on that nationalization and this nationalism, I learned something interesting here, which is the 1977 Janata Manifesto talks about bread and liberty. They'll provide bread and liberty. And I found that to be a very interesting thing to put in a manifesto, because it says that we are not going to do a trade-off between bread versus liberty, but we are going to provide both. And that to me was, again, a thing. And finally, one last comment is your point about commodification with protection in the clustering of states that you talk about. So is this commodification, can it coexist with citizenship? So that's one thing. Thank you.
Thanks, Anindita and Rajendran. Rich set of comments. I'm not sure Louise can respond to every one of them, though there are some overlapping ones. Just in terms of time, I'd say 5 to 7 minutes, Louise, and then maybe you can weave those into the questions from the audience as well. Yeah.
Thank you. So thank you, first of all, for such wonderful, rich comments and for drawing out so many more themes of the book as well. I'm really grateful to you for those interventions. And there's a lot here to chew through, so forgive me if I don't address everything. But I wanted to, there are a few questions which really spoke to me and I thought would be worth reflecting on. And Ani, I thought I'd begin where you finished, which was on the lessons from the rural. One of the things that really struck me in writing this book was how much of the impetus for rural social security came from the urban. So this was an urban problem. It was because urban poverty was increasing, for instance, and rural to urban migration was increasing in Maharashtra. That's where you saw the big push for EGS. And you see that too in the debates about the Food for Work programme. This was about addressing a rural crisis because it was creating instability in the cities. And there's fascinating newspaper editorials from the time in Bombay, really alarmist, you know, the influx into the city and Bombay must be saved. And the employment guarantee scheme in Bombay, in Maharashtra as a response to a crisis in the city, which I wasn't expecting to see. And also, interestingly, the only moment I found of an example of redistributive taxation from urban to rural. So the EGS was funded by a cess on urban salaries. So yeah, that's a partial answer to your question, but it was one that was surprising to me. You both pushed me on citizenship and rights and what I describe as, well, it's not actually my term, but the term protective social policies as distinctive from promotional. And I don't intend in the book to collapse the rights-based approach into it being an example of protective policy. But what I wanted to bring to light was precisely actually the contribution of people like S. Guhan in this moment. So until the early 1990s, you have a very deep suspicion of anything, and this is the case for policymakers at all levels, of anything that might look like a dole. So anything that would produce dependence on the state. Since I've been in India for the last few days, a number of people have asked me questions about whether dependence on welfare is likely to depress people's incentives to work. And you see these debates. These were sent. So the Maharashtra's employment guarantee scheme, for instance, did include an unemployment allowance, which the Planning Commission was deeply suspicious of. And the central government didn't want to give assent to the state level legislation because of the dole. And there was nothing like that until Narega was introduced. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Schemes didn't include that. And so why Guhan and what happens in the 1990s, I think, is so significant. And this, of course, predates the rights revolution, if you like, of the 2000s, is because you start to have this slightly more Beveridge-like understanding of the function of a welfare state also being to support people who are not able to commodify themselves. So this is, central to Esping Anderson's idea of decommodification, that the state needs to step in order to provide for people in contingencies in their life cycle, which mean they can't work. So due to childbearing or to old age or to sickness. So when I point to the significance of the emergence of protective ideas, it's that I'm pointing to, as distinct from what had hitherto been really an approach that was focused either on citizens' duty to put themselves to work, or the duty of the state to intervene in order to enable them to work through employment generation schemes. But I wouldn't want to then flatten what are rather a different set of interventions that come with the rights moment into simply examples of rights-based policies. The rights moment takes those protective policies and it does something different to them. And absolutely that is about reimagining what citizenship means. you both reflect more eloquently than I probably can on the dilemma of what citizenship entails today. And I think those are very important questions to be asking, especially when we think about the idea of the welfare state and the way that the welfare discourse has become so flattened. The kind of denigration of welfare as freebies, as generating dependency, as being less desirable than other forms of capital investment for development. These are very different ways of thinking about the ends of state intervention in markets than the rights-based moment was, which was precisely about thinking of citizens as rights-bearing individuals with certain entitlements that they could uphold vis-a-vis the state. And of course, breathing life into structures of accountability, which, Ani, as you're exactly right, start with Panchayati Raj, but then take on new shape with, especially with Narega, implemented through panchayats. That this is very importantly an institutional innovation, as you kind of push me to consider, as much as anything else. The Ambedkar question, let me come to that, because that's one of my favourite puzzles, and there may be people in the room who have ideas about how it might be explained. So I was, firstly, Ambedkar's tenure as member for Labour on the Viceroy's Executive Council is a curious omission from biographies of Ambedkar. And Ambedkar himself, there are very fleeting speeches that he gave in the national Labour conferences, for instance, which he chaired as member for Labour. But I was not able to find Ambedkar, in his own words, provide us with much of an explanation for what I know happened, because we see it in the correspondence about the Beveridge visit, for why he was so insistent about confining the scope of this inquiry to industrial labour. So that's why I speculate in the book that this may have been connected to his broader idea that urbanisation and industrialisation was essential for caste emancipation. And therefore, he saw the future of India, as requiring a move from the rural into the urban via industrialization. That's my best guess, but I would love to. I would love somebody else to be able to dig deeper into this and provide more insight. Maybe I'll leave it there, Arun, to leave time for questions as well.
Good evening. My name is Manish. I teach law at the National Law School. Thank you very much for this presentation and what promises to be a very exciting book. I'm going to request you if you can draw a thread from some of your earlier work, which to me feels very relevant to interpreting this one. And I'm talking about the question of fiscal federalism. Post 1991 and especially post 2000, we've seen the union placing increasing fetters on state borrowing, most recently by tying fiscal devolution to the question of how states restrict their spending, and simultaneously centralizing revenue generation through the introduction of the GST and the GST Council in the last decade. And the question is, how does this story fit in with the story that you've just told us?
I'm Saurav. I teach at National Law School and work on labor law and law and poverty. Thanks for the talk. And I skimmed through the introduction of the book before the talk. So I have a couple of comments and questions in response to that. One, you began with your reference to Neeraja Jayal's whole argument on how social policy concerns were put into part 4 of the Constitution. And I was wondering whether in your research and in your book, you've looked at how much of that actually played a role in the decision-making matrix of Ambedkar or the Nehruvian regime. Because when I look at the 2 labor rights that were included in part 3, those got translated into labor legislation only as late as 1970s when the Bonded Labor System Abolition Act was passed. and Child Labour Act came even later in 1980s. On the other hand, the Provident Fund Act was put into place in early 1950s. The ESI Act predates the Constitution. You had several other labor standards which were turned into legislation in 1948, early 1950s. So did it really matter that much, or are we lawyers reading too much into that distinction between Part 3 and Part 4 and undermining the political determinants that may have shaped those decisions? The second and a very short question I'll have is with respect to the choice to limit social protection only to industrialized workplaces. And you refer to Ambedkar's rejection of beverages more ambitious plan. But can we see a continuity from what the Royal Commission on Labour also spoke of, when they also, in context of minimum wage, did not speak of universal protection, but only in selective sectors? So is that more of a continuity of the earlier colonial deliberations that you found in your work?
Thank you. Really good questions. So on the fiscal side, there obviously is a big fiscal story here, and I don't get deep into the fiscal story in this book. But the picture that you point to post 1991, I don't think there's. I think we've had. It's not been a linear trajectory in terms of fiscal centralisation since 1991. There have also been important moments, especially with the 14th Finance Commission, of course, of quite substantial fiscal decentralisation. But I think the big story probably on the fiscal, in terms of fiscal transfers, is how important centrally sponsored schemes have been, right, in welfare design. So most of the programmes that we're talking about are centrally sponsored, even if they've often started life at the state level. They've often then been migrated to the national level. And then that involves the central government setting an agenda for states to follow with an expectation of match funding. So even before we see the kind of fiscal crunch that we're seeing at the moment at the state level, centrally sponsored schemes have also meant that the central government has loomed large in policy design over social policy for much longer. And that's a story that goes back to Indira Gandhi. As I'm sure you know. On the directive principles and how much they've mattered. So I haven't. So the reason I mentioned them here at the outset is really because I think that's part of the reason why scholars of political economy and historians of political economy have kind of neglected the welfare piece, because the kind of assumption is, well, there's nothing much doing there. Because these were downgraded in the constitutional moment. But your question pushes us to think about what happens to different kinds of labour and when those rights were established. And I think in your question actually, you possibly demonstrate that this did matter. So that the things that the labour standards that did get legislated on were things that were already in train before the Constitution was promulgated. And in answer to your second question, they absolutely date back to the Royal Commission of Labour in India. So that's the first time that you see the proposal for a system of sickness insurance and a whole host of other things as well. But it's that kind of continuity, I think, which drives the labour legislation that you did see in the late 1940s and the 1950s. And I think that story is quite divorced really from what was happening with the directive principles.
Yeah, good evening. I was really interested by the discussion. I'm Arav Bardhan and I'm a first year BLLB student at NLS Bangalore. My question revolves around the idea of freebies and welfare schemes. So my first introduction to a welfare scheme was the Maharashtra government's Majhi Ladki Bahin Yojana, where women were given rupees 1,500 per month. So through my mother's conversation with our house help and cook, we learned that in her locality, women who were receiving that amount, instead of working at one extra house a day, they were working one less house. They were just sitting at home. So I understand the theory of welfare schemes being an answer to India's failure to provide broad-based, inclusive, employment-driven growth. But it's kind of difficult to separate these welfare schemes and freebies, which we think as wasteful expenditure, when there are such examples close to home. So how do we get over that kind of mental block which these stories and examples create?
the greatest problem in India today, as I see, is the greeds of the few in constant conflict with the needs of the millions. How do you deal with that for the future?
Hello. Sorry, I had something to add and get your thoughts on the Ambedkar point. So there's one essay I read a while ago by Ambedkar called "The Indian Ghetto Outside the Fold," where the word's strong, but the word I would use is Ambedkar shows a disdain for the rural. It's in response to Charles Metcalfe, who glorifies the Hindu village republic for its insularity and its resistance to the external changes that are happening, whatever wars or anything. The Hindu village republic, does not fall. And this very insularity is what Ambedkar shows disdain for. So he's very skeptical that this Hindu village republic will not allow for any social progress or changes. Maybe that adds something. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Louise, and to the panelists for an amazing conversation. As someone who has followed your earlier work on federalism, I'm very happy to have a copy of your latest work today. So many things in this book trigger my interest, but I'll stick to something which is close to home, Tamil Nadu. I remembered reading in S. Narayan's book, The Dravidian Years, where he made a comment on Jayalalitha's Amma canteens. So he said that I tried to figure out what was the policy or theoretical inspiration for this, but I couldn't find any. Right. So how does this fit in this broader idea of the protective social security schemes which Tamil Nadu has been developing since the 1980s? And I am intrigued by the fact that you highlight the 1980s, which was obviously the period where MGR was in. Now, MGR also, as has been noted by his critics, was not really a theoretician or a thinker. So where did he get this idea to develop this sort of as Narendra Subramaniam called it, paternalistic populism? I'm not particularly comfortable with the term, but still I think it's a useful rubric to look at the policies of AIADMK. Thank you.
Shall I take these? So let me start with the first question, which, as I said earlier, I've been asked a version of this. You're not the fifth person to ask me the version of this question, so it clearly is an important one. My very honest answer to that is, if it's true that a recipient of this cash transfer scheme has decided not to take on an additional household to clean or to do some domestic work in, that's probably a good thing, because she has been able to decide what her boundaries are around what work she takes on, and she has been given choice. So for me, that's actually perhaps an argument that a welfare scheme is working. It may make life more difficult for the urban elite who have more trouble finding domestic workers, but that is, and if that is the case, that is going to, I think, become a really important political battleground in cities, because what it potentially opens up the possibility for is something that actually resets the relationship between private employers and their employees. So I don't think we know nearly enough yet about the actual impacts of this host of new cash transfer programs. Maharashtra is one of the largest, but Karnataka also has very large cash transfer programs directed to women and free bus travel and so on. Tamil Nadu, Madhya Pradesh, these have now been diffused across a number of states. So I think we really need now serious research to look at the impact of these schemes on exactly these questions. But I would embolden you even further to say this is exactly why we need to leave aside the discourse of freebies, because that's not really allowing us to see what's happening here with these policies. And that may not actually be the design of the politicians who've introduced this policy in order to win the Maharashtra election. But if that's what's happening socially, that's fascinating. So that would be my answer there. To your question at the front, sir, I think it's the most fundamental question that one could ask, and I can't do justice to it, really. The story I tell in the book is exactly one, and in part this reflects my answer to the previous questioner, in which elite interests have been just as important, often more important than the interests of the poor in the design of welfare policies. And one might argue that that is a bit of a problem. And that is also reflective of the fact that this is not a welfare regime that has been born or really nurtured on the basis of a principle of redistribution. And that also relates to the fiscal question as well. That this is not, that there has not been a debate about taxing the rich to support the poor at any period of history, apart from that very brief moment in the case of the EGS in Maharashtra. On the Ambedkar essay on the Indian ghetto, yes, that's my own inclination as to how to explain his decision to focus on industrial workers. But I just haven't seen him, in his own words, explain the decision using that logic. But that's what I speculate in the book, exactly. And on the Amma canteens, absolutely an example of a protective welfare scheme. I don't know personally enough about Tamil Nadu to tell you exactly where MGR got his ideas from. I can tell you, though, that S. Guhan, who features heavily in this book, and whose private papers I was able to access because they've been deposited in Teenmurti, was central to what happened under Karunanidhi in the later 1980s, and then the rollout at the national level of social assistance. But there will be other important people too.
I'm Babu Matthew. I teach at the National Law University. I think when we are trying to decipher Ambedkar, it's useful to also think of Nehru simultaneously. And I say that because Nehru's thinking in relation to the type of Fabian socialism that he subscribes to originates from he mentions it in the discovery of India, the deindustrialization of India through British intervention. And that is such a phenomenon that Nehru points out this is reverse migration compared to the rest of the world. People are leaving urban centers and coming to rural India. And it is in that context that he opts for industrialization as the only way forward for India's development. And Ambedkar, being a Fabian socialist, just like Nehru, subscribes to the same point of view. There may be other issues on which Ambedkar differs with Nehru. But I think on this aspect, that's a feature which is common. Proceeding a little more into the welfare scheme, yes, it is ESI and EPF which are the most outstanding social security measures even today. I was saying that, yes, ESI and EPF, if you look at it, they are contributory systems. And therefore, the financial implication of a welfare scheme is also simultaneously addressed. Otherwise, ESI and EPF takes care of 9 ILO standards. We are satisfied if we can get that for the entire workforce in India. That's what we would like to aim for. It's interesting that the same Ambedkar also looks out for a welfare model which is not based on contribution, especially when it comes to mine workers and coal workers. He sets up welfare boards, and that is addressing all questions of worker welfare. So it's not that you can push Ambedkar into only a particular model of welfare. I think he is embracing much more. And the last thing I want to mention is, as we are struggling for extending welfare to the 600 million in the workforce, to the 93% among them, we consider the fundamental rights, the directive principles of state policy extremely valuable. We see the similarity between fundamental rights and core labor standards, and the similarity between directive principles of state policy and decent conditions at work. And if we bring this together, it's a completely acceptable framework for future social security work.
Sorry, my question is actually, I just wanted to understand the rubrics of what would you consider the purposes of welfare, which was asked before. My background is that of an economist, and I'm talking about this from the point of view of A, state capacity. Two is the idea of where do we fund this from. The aspect of the marginal cost of public funding, which has not, we don't have a lot of work around this in India, but ideally for every rupee, dollar spent, etc., there's so much more that you're taking away from private citizens. And the last point is with regards to the fact that all of the current incentives, like you said, are sometimes a little bit skewed to rural population, but we also see contribution to GDP currently coming in excessively from urban areas. And I want to know how you think about the protection of migrant labor in light of what we're seeing in terms of the movement to urban centers.
Hi. So this is, I'm picking off from your answer to someone where you spoke about Karnataka schemes. So one, you mentioned as a response that the counter to this is that the elite urban people traditionally oppose these schemes. But one thing that usually runs is that, and this is an example of Karnataka. So the 5 schemes resulted in close to more than a 40% reduction in the budget allocation for important sectors such as agriculture, water resources, and there was a higher fiscal deficit than which is ideal. So the counter to this is that some other schemes also end up reducing their budget. So how would you balance these concerns that you allocate a little more to some schemes like free bus travel, but it takes away from other important such schemes?
Hi, my name is Arun. Just an observation based on your previous comment that maybe the elites are maybe more, biased, or they are getting more favors in comparison to the poor. But I come from the state of Kerala where the inequality is much more lesser and more uniform, social status. So in that respect, I see inequality plays a role in the implementation of welfare schemes. And I see Kerala as probably a good model where you see a good welfare schemes visible in the streets. Of course, even the primary health centers are really good out there. So I think inequality do play a role in the implementation of welfare schemes.
Hi, my name is Rohan and I work on issues of migrant labor and debt. The question was on debt, actually. Question was on debt. How, because around the 1990s, around the liberalization time, you also see the emergence of microfinance institutions and a promotion of entrepreneurship as a method of poverty alleviation. It also connects to the duty to work. When in my conversations, people have said that, microfinance debt is good because it enables people to work as migrants or otherwise so that they can pay back their debt. So just wanted you to unpack what's the thought behind promoting debt as a method of poverty alleviation? How does it connect to the regular welfare schemes? Because it was argued that Chandrababu Naidu, he promoted debt alongside withdrawing some of the welfare schemes of the state as well. So yeah, I'll stop there.
I feel with this round of questions, we're really pushing at the frontiers of debates that need to be had about welfare. There are a number of questions there about the trade-offs between welfare expenditure and other kinds of development expenditure. And those are debates that I think go to the heart of a social contract in politics, and they're good debates to be having. I can't really give you an answer. There are, of course, fiscal trade-offs. There are also decisions that states can make to alter rates of taxation. The budget this year introduced more tax breaks for middle classes, and we know that there are also plenty of subsidies for capital as well. So there are decisions about resourcing the state, which are relevant for thinking about the trade-offs that welfare expenditure present as well. The pie is not a fixed pie. One has to think about how that pie is also shaped. But I think that it's very healthy for a society to have these kinds of questions debated. But I would caution against the assumption that welfare expenditure is simply unproductive expenditure and likely to deflate work effort. A couple of people asked about migrant labour, and again, I think this is absolutely front and centre of the kind of evolving needs for reforms, and there is of course a lot of work being done on access by migrant labourers to different forms of welfare outside of their state of origin. Labour migration, labour circulation, you will see it as a theme throughout the book. This was also a big concern in the 1930s at the time of the Royal Commission of Labour that we talked about earlier, but it remains a very pressing issue today. What am I missing out? Maybe just pick up on the point on Kerala and inequality. I think this is a really important point. The level of inequality in a society is really important for both success in the implementation of welfare schemes, and some of you may be aware of Prerna Singh's work on subnationalism and the significance of cohesive subnational identities, which are more likely to arise in contexts of lower inequality, which means that there is more social buy-in to scrutinising the delivery of public goods by the state. And so I think some of the discourse and concerns about freebies, especially in states like Maharashtra, are also reflective of levels of inequality in those societies, and the absence of such cohesive senses of what Prerna Singh describes as we feeling, common bonds of citizenship amongst people from different class positions. I think I feel, Babu, we ought to have a longer conversation, but I think I agree with you on the significance of Nehru and Ambedkar and Fabian socialism in that period, shaping their thinking about industrialisation. Thank you.
I'm just going to thank everyone for coming. These events happen because of a lot of people working behind the scenes. I can't thank everyone by name, but people at BIC, at the National Law School, and people like Rajendran who've come all the way from Sarjapur for this as well, and others from different parts of the city. Thank you very much, and please join me in congratulating Louise for a wonderful book and a wonderful event.